Good evening, aviation aficionados. It is good to see you. I'm Jamie Beckett, AOPA's You Can Fly ambassador to the Eastern U.S. Down there on the bottom of my screen is Pat Brown, way over in Texas, and way out there on the left coast of the United States, the fabulous Kay Sundaram, who covers the Western U.S. Of course, we've got Donnie McKay in the background making that gerbil run on the wheel, so all this stuff works. We had a hurricane not long ago here, so I'm not promising my connection actually remains, but I leave you in the capable hands of Pat and Kay. As we talk about tonight, winter is coming. Now, let me preface this by saying I live in Florida, Pat lives in Texas, Kay lives in Southern California. Winter is a theoretical thing for us, but we have all been up north. We have all experienced the cold. I used to instruct out of a school in Connecticut. Pat actually learned to fly in Michigan during the winter. So we have a little bit of insight. As always, you're allowed to come up with any topic you want. Go ahead and ask a question right there in the comments section on YouTube or on Facebook. We are thrilled to have you. Please thumbs up in the pattern if you're awake. If you're doing something functional, if you're not snoring at this moment, give me a thumbs up in the comments. Kay, it's not just about the cold when we talk about the winter thing. I mean, there's more to it, meteorological things, but let me just say a personal bugaboo is I believe frost is evil. It should be outlawed. Frost should not be allowed anywhere near an airport. And yet, since our aircraft are primarily metal and there's condensation and stuff, it happens. Have you ever faced frost out there in Southern California?
I have. I have flown to, Big Bear, for example. It does get cold out there. And for someone coming from a very warm climate, that could be a rude awakening if you are not used to those temperatures. But you got to think of frost, snow, ice, anything that can accumulate on the wings, the elevators, the other surfaces when the aircraft is parked outside or even inside if it gets cold. And you got to remove all of that, because if you don't, you are now a test pilot. You might be thinking, oh, frost is just so, it's nominal, it's so lightweight, it's so thin, but you're changing the aerodynamic surfaces of the aircraft, and you're now a test pilot. And so it's really important that you take that seriously. And so, yeah, I have dealt with it in not very often, but it's important to remove all of that so you're not allowing it to change the flight characteristics. You can have increased stall speeds, longer takeoff rolls, or even an inability to fly at all if you have a lot of frost on the airplane.
Hey, by the way, for those of us who live within a couple dozen feet of sea level, what's the elevation at Big Bear?
It's about 7,000 feet. So we're not, we're not talking about.
I'm sorry, we don't have anything anywhere near.
Yeah, I have big mountains all around me, and so it's you got to get a mountain checkout from all of the flight schools and flying clubs that I know if you want to rent a plane, and it's just smart. Mountain flying is very different than flying at sea level or in flat country. So that's a different topic, and we could talk all in the whole hour about mountain flying, but you really do need to get a checkout for that.
Yeah, and Pat, you get colder in Texas down in the Houston area than we do here. You've got to have some experience with frost. I know it was one of those things that really bugged me, still does, that I know people who fly with frost on their wings, and they don't seem to be willing to listen to the thing. It's not about how heavy it is. It's about interrupting laminar flow. Do you have a way of expressing to people that frost is mega evil and don't even try it?
Don't do it. That's about the best I can tell you. No, you mentioned about, most airplanes are made out of metal, hence frost. But I'll tell you, I've owned a couple of Cirruses, or Cirri, perhaps is the plural, I don't know, over in my life. And about 3 years ago, before I got rid of the one that I had at that point, I was doing a rusty pilot seminar up in Mineola, Texas, which is just a little north and west of Tyler, in December. And when I came out to the airport, in Tyler to get ready to fly over to Mineola, which is about 20 miles away. There was frost on the wings of that plastic airplane. So, I had them pull it out into the sun, and it still wasn't melting as quickly as I was happy. So I ended up going and getting some hot water and some rags and things like that, thinking foolishly that might help it. It only made it worse for a while, and just had to wait till Mother Nature melted it. But I'll tell you what, it was awfully tempting to take off with that little coating of frost on the wings, because, hey, it's just a little bit of frost, and I'm by myself in that 310 horsepower airplane with way more power than it needed to carry me. But, I just remember all the horror stories and bad things that happen when you take off with frost on the wings. And so, I waited until it melted, or to the point where I could actually take a cloth and wipe off the residue, and then took off, and it was just fine.
Yeah, we really only see frost here as a result of long distance, high altitude cruise, where you cold soak the airframe and then you land in Florida during the humidity festival. Only 10 months long. You gotta get in here, but it is so humid and the airframe is so cold you can get frost. Luckily, it melts off rapidly. But Danny Carson says frost is here in East Tennessee, and my apologies to you, Danny. Although I understand some people like this change of seasons. It's not for me, but I guess some people like it. Air J says hello. Right back to you, Air J, on YouTube. It's nice to see you. Cavalier 102.5 back for a return trip. We see him often. He says hot water freezes faster than cold. I had a biology teacher in high school who said that wasn't true, but I don't know. I just know water freezes, and I try and stay very far from there. I was mentioning to you earlier, Pat, the freezing level for me is about 150 miles north of here.
Right.
So I don't really have a deal with it, but we do have to think about that freezing level, don't we, Kay? Where that is, and there are weather charts that show it to us. But if you've got freezing level at the ground, you're aware of what's going on. But if that freezing level is, say, at 2,000 or 3,000 feet, and you're going to be flying IFR, going through some clouds from 3,000 to 5,000 feet, we could be picking up ice, couldn't we?
Absolutely. You have to know where the freezing level is. Around here, there's so much terrain, and freezing level is not something that you could just look outside and say, oh, I can tell that the freezing level is at 3,000 feet, or by looking outside. You can see ice forming on your airplane. Hopefully you don't let it happen, but you can't see where the freezing level is. So that's something that is very critical that you do your pre-flight planning, and you look at the weather charts, and you know where the freezing level is, and then think about your route. If you have to circumnavigate, or if you have to go to your alternate, can you climb up to get to your alternate? Because it might be on the other side of the mountain. Hopefully in this area, if you are flying to an airport, whether you are required to have an alternate or not, you do pick one, and you don't pick one that is very close to your destination. So this is where it's really important. Can I get around the mountains and go to my alternate, or am I going to encounter the freezing level and be in moisture in the clouds? So that's what you gotta pay attention to. That's real serious around here.
Yeah, Christopher Ritchie's on YouTube, and he says de-icing fluid is the same as radiator fluid, antifreeze, brought up to 210 degrees and then sprayed on the airplanes. Commercial operators use this so that they don't form ice during takeoff or de-ice whatever's there. I've never used that, Pat, but I got to admit, the first time I ever got structural icing surprised the heck out of me, because it was winter up north. I was flying out of this place, Meriden Markham in Meriden, Connecticut, where I used to fly. And it was probably 1,400 or 1,500 foot overcast. So I was just doing pattern work with a student. And I was probably on the third time around when I realized we were picking up rime ice. And I was dumb enough at that point that I thought, being below the clouds, I'm not in them, I won't get any ice. And the truth was, I was picking up ice. You do plenty of IFR flying. Have you ever picked up structural ice? And what's your thought on that dilemma?
Well, yes, twice. Once, twice. One time I was coming out of Dallas. This is out of Addison, Texas. This was probably 4 years ago or so, maybe 3 years. It was just before the pandemic, and it was in February, and it was reasonably shirt sleeve weather actually that day. And it was actually it was that evening as I was coming. It was just getting dark, and we had a 2,000-foot overcast. And normally I don't fly IFR at night, even in the Cirrus with a parachute. But because it was 2,000 feet and forecast to be clear, in fact, current conditions were clear in Waco, which was just a little bit south of that. And I was confident I could get on top of the clouds. I went ahead and launched. And again, let me emphasize that the reason I made that decision was because it was 2,000-foot overcast, AGL, plenty of safety margin below the clouds if it came down to that. ATC climbed me up to a particular altitude. I don't remember what it was, but it left me just kind of skimming the top of the clouds, kind of in and out of the clouds, but skimming the top of it. And finally, they let me climb up to a higher altitude and hand me off to Waco. And Waco called me up and said, "Did you come across any icing?" And I have to tell you, admitting something really stupid, it didn't occur to me that I would have picked up icing in the clouds because of the shirt sleeve weather that I was in down below. So I picked up the flashlight and looked out on the leading edge of the wing. And sure enough, there was a little ice on the leading edge of the wing. And it was like, oh my goodness, that I said something a little different than that, but it was, oh my goodness, that's a surprise. And then I looked at the OAT on the outside air temperature on the PFD in the airplane and realized I should have anticipated this, the lapse rate. I should have had the pitot heat on. There's a lot of things I should have done. And you can be sure I've never repeated that mistake again. But
getting ice is that's an eye opener. That's one of those things, especially when you're in an aircraft that has no way of getting rid of it. Of course, anti-ice and de-ice being totally different things. But without the ability to get rid of ice, even the smallest amount, I'm looking for some place to go because this is not going to get better on its own. Yeah. By the way, Kawakawa is watching us on Facebook, and I'll come right to you, Kay, I promise. But Kawakawa has a really interesting comment that I was going to get to in a little bit. He says, what you won't see is icing in control surface gaps and fuel vents. And it's one of the things I remember from being up north. It would snow overnight, and somebody would come out for an early morning flight, and their airplane was tied down outside, and it's covered with snow, and they'd put it in the heated hangar, and it would all melt off fairly quickly. But I've actually seen this where somebody pulled it back out, started it up, taxied down. By the time they get to the run-up area, that runoff has frozen inside the ailerons and things, and you got an even bigger problem if you were to take off. So this really has to be a longer term solution. It's not just melt the snow. You have to get rid of all that water that's going to freeze again. Kay, I'm sorry. What could we discuss that's on your mind?
I just wanted to elaborate one thing that Pat mentioned about the outside air temperature. So one should watch that outside air temperature gauge throughout the flight, especially during the climbs. You want to check if an easy way to validate the overall forecast while you're trying to determine what that freezing level is for the current location, because forecasts are not always as they say, right? And so keep checking that outside air temperature, but also be aware that the OAT probe might be affected by ice or if it's wet also.
Yeah, I like to think that forecasts are always wrong. They show us a trend, but the actual details are generally wrong. And I'm not mad at anybody. They're doing a better job than I would do. Connor Wilder, by the way, says he used to be a ramp agent at Appleton Airport. I believe that's in Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken. And I was in Wisconsin in the summer, and I thought it was cold. So I imagine the winter is really cold. Connor, hat off to you. I think that's fantastic. But, Pat, it's not really just icing or snow on the wings. Cold just being cold can have an effect. I mean, if nothing else, your oil thickens up. I mean, there's a reason they use multi viscosity oils. Here in Florida, we use hundredweight, pretty much standard. We just go with hundredweight because our temperatures between the 70s and the 90s. But when it gets cold, I mean, it can be really hard to start that plane, either because the battery's lost some of its oomph from the cold, or the oil has thickened up, or a whole variety of things. Do you have a cold weather starting procedure, or is it something that is unique plane to plane? How do you think about it?
Well, down here in Houston, where the winters generally aren't terribly cold, occasionally it'll get down into the 20s, except for last year when it got down into the minus numbers and killed everything. But I've got an incandescent light bulb that we have in a trouble light, and if I'm going to be flying one of the airplanes there, I'll just put that trouble light in the engine compartment underneath the oil pan, and normally it'll heat the oil up enough. If I can get that oil to 40 or 50 degrees, I'm happy. But I'm certainly not going to try to start an engine without preheating it, especially if it gets down into the 20s and 30s. That's just, that will just do more damage to your engine than you can possibly imagine, because it takes time for that oil to warm up and really begin circulating. And until that happens, it's just metal on metal. So you got to be really, really careful cold starting an engine in cold weather.
Yeah, there's another one that's always bothered me, and especially in cold weather. People pump the throttle, which it makes me cringe, because when you pump the throttle, you're injecting fuel directly into the carburetor. And if the engine should backfire, you can have a fire now, and it can be really unpleasant. Much better to use the primer, which is injecting fuel right into the induction system or into the cylinders themselves. So you're not going to have a fire from that. But that part really gets me. I'm not a big fan of that. Okay, the other thing is just fuel doesn't vaporize well in the cold. That's part of the reason people are pumping the throttle, or in my case, or hopefully people are using the primer. But, everything is colder. It's not just you and the airframe, and the seat is kind of crunchy. And, as Pat says, the oil is thick. Even the fuel, it just doesn't want to vaporize because it's cold. So every airplane has some type of procedure, but it's actually worth learning from the locals, don't you think? Where in Big Bear, they might have a very different way of starting an airplane in February than they do down in Santa Monica.
Correct. And this is where it's important for the pilot to be real familiar with the aircraft, the pilot operating handbook for that specific airplane. They may have a special start procedure for cold starts or for hot starts. Hot starts is another, that's going to be another seminar, right? I've seen some very unusual ways that people have started a hot engine. But the key is to get that pilot operating handbook out and see what the manufacturer, they know better as far as what is the best way to start that engine. And then also, check with the locals at the FBOs. They've been doing this day in and day out, and so they might be able to give you some tips.
Yeah, and Pat, you mentioned having access to a Cirrus at one point, being a part owner of one. And I don't mean to be offensive. People refer to them as plastic airplanes, but plastic does get, the actual plastic inside the cabin area, it can get very brittle and cold, especially when it gets really cold. So it actually pays to take care getting in and out of the airplane. Are there any things that you particularly key on when you're entering or exiting the airplane in the cold, just because something might be more brittle or the lubrication might not work as well?
Well, it's not just the cold, Jamie. It's the especially down here, it's the continuing cycling between extreme hot, where it could be 120 degrees in the cockpit of the airplane if you don't have sunshades and it's parked outside in August, all the way down to where it could be 20 degrees. So, now, and up north, it's a similar thing. If you've got If you're in Michigan or really Ohio or any of the places up there, it'll get 90 or 95 degrees sometimes in the summertime. And then again, it cycles down to 20 degrees in the wintertime. So back and forth between hot and cold will do it as well. And just the age of the plastic too. I mean, even if it was in a climate stable situation, the older the plastic gets, the more brittle it gets. But that's just one more thing to keep in mind when you're getting into an airplane that has a plastic element to its interior in the wintertime, is being aware of, look, this could be old, this could be 40-year-old plastic, and you grab a hold of it just right, and it will crumble in your hand. I've had it happen. So it isn't just the cold, but that will exacerbate the situation.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. By the way, we've got two comments I really want to touch on. One is Mark E. Nicholson, who says forecasters aren't wrong, but their timing is really bad. I apologize. This brings to mind a story. When I was a kid, Hartford, Connecticut, there was a radio personality named Bob Steele. He was an institution in radio. He was famous amongst radio people. And he gave the best weather report I ever heard in my life. My mom used to listen to Bob Steele while I was getting ready for school. And he said, the weather report is it's going to rain on and off forever. And I just thought that was the best one I'd ever heard. John Delanoy is in New York, upstate New York. He says he's a fairly new pilot, 2 years, 210 hours. Good for you, John. He recently got his complex checkout in a Mooney M20J, but he's still a low-time pilot. And winter is traditionally a time when a lot of people don't fly, especially way up north. It's just cold. It's uncomfortable. Maybe the airport gets snowed in or whatever. And John's asking a really good question. How can I keep from losing proficiency during the winter months? And Kay, I'm a big fan of flying clubs or social organizations where you have the ability to interact with other people. And maybe that's the EAA chapter down at your airport. Maybe there actually is a flying club. Maybe it's the Civil Air Patrol. Do you have anything that you direct people to during those months of the year where maybe they just can't get out to the airport to fly as much as they want, but they might stay somewhat proficient, at least in the head work?
I think that flying clubs are a great way to get your certificate and to maintain the currency. And the nice part of it is you're surrounded by like-minded individuals who are probably in the same boat as you are. And they oftentimes have activities that you can participate in, and they might be safety seminars. Some might be social, some might be educational. A lot of flying clubs around here, they really promote chair flying. That's something that I'm really big on. I think that when you are in a situation where you can't fly for whatever reason, whether it is weather, whether it's medical, whether it's you're traveling, you're too busy to get out to the airports, the scheduling can be a challenge, and cost. This is where you should just go to the aircraft if you can. That's the best way to do it, to be able to sit in an airplane and go through the motions and get your checklist out and remember the buttonology. I see pilots who haven't flown for a while. They come into an aircraft, especially if it's something with a glass cockpit, a G1000, something like that, and the buttonology really gets them, and they're just button mashing, and they're not even sure what to hit. And so this is where you can sit on the ground, connect a ground power unit, and go through all of that on your own. And then if you need a CFI, that's fine, but that's a great way to stay proficient, is to chair fly or sit in a simulator. That'll cost you a little bit more money, but then you can shoot an approach. If it's a full motion, that's even better. But I know that costs even more money. But really, your head has got to stay in the game, even when you can't physically go and fly. And chair flying, it's free, right? And if you can remind yourself all the checklist procedures, then when you do go back and fly, you're going to be ahead of the game, ahead of the ball.
Pat, I was kind of congratulating myself in the head because, as you know, I'm a genius. And as I threw that question to Kay, I was thinking, I'm going to come back to Pat and talk about simulators, but GHI Grip S197 and Kay beat me to it. saying, you know, a quality flight simulator setup at home can be an excellent tool to stay proficient. But it's also for somebody who's actually a private pilot and got their high performance endorsement, it might be a great time to think about starting your instrument training, which you can do in a sim right there at the local flight school, or invite a CFI over to your house if you've got one that's loggable. But that's a really good way to stay in the game, don't you think?
Yeah, if you've got even just a home simulator for procedural stuff, I do like simulators for procedural stuff because it's a good way for you to kind of keep current on the buttonology, assuming that the sim that you've got has buttons that are like what you have in your real airplane. Otherwise, you know, there's always a possibility of a negative transfer of learning if you're learning the wrong patterns of buttonology on your simulator and they don't transfer into the airplane. That can be a negative thing. But generally speaking, I really do like simulators for procedural stuff. And of course, as you said, Jamie, it may be loggable depending on the sim and whether you have a letter of authorization from the FAA to use it as loggable time, and that's an entirely different seminar right there.
Yeah, yeah, it is. But you know, there are options. That's the great part. Kay, I'm going to come back to you again because Cavalier 102.5 is pointing out that the cylinders need to be above freezing as well as the oil, because you can have oil that's 60 degrees and cylinder heads that are 20 degrees, which kind of brings us to the Tannis heater, don't you think? That's kind of an interesting device that an awful lot of people up north might consider if they're aircraft owners.
Yes. So the question is, when should an aircraft engine be preheated? And most experts recommend any time that temperatures drop near or below freezing, but 32 degrees Fahrenheit is the general guideline. And so the Tannis heater, and this, I'm just becoming familiar with it. I actually have it on the Cirrus that I fly a lot, and I haven't used it. I will say that right up front. But there's a picture. That's not my airplane, but that was taken at Oshkosh, and you can see the Tannis booth in the back. I did go and I visited them because you can only see it really with the cowling open. You can just peek through the opening when it's closed up, but here's a full view there. And so Tannis has a wide range of piston engine preheat products, and then they have kits for engines from manufacturers like Continental, Lycoming, Rotex, and more. And so why use it? Well, the preheat system will thoroughly heat soak your engine. And so essentially you're heating up the cylinders slowly. And by slowly, I mean it takes hours, not minutes. And so the key is to keep the metal above the dew point, removing the chance of any condensation on your engine. So condensation forms when that warm oil, the water vapor rises from your oil pan, and then it hits a colder surface like your cylinder heads. And so this is the main reason why you want your cylinders, in your case, warmer than your oil pan. And so if you have that Tannis heater, especially in the warm climates, just make sure that you give yourself, adequate time, so that, because it does take a while to heat up the cylinders. Something else that people use, and this was given to me when I acquired this particular airplane, is a winterization kit. I've never used it yet, but it's still sitting here in my home office. But this just goes right in. Let's see, in the front, and so it's all about just keeping the heat inside. So that's a little bit. But Jamie, you're the A&P. Maybe you can explain a little bit more about how that Tannis heater works. I know the purpose of it, what you need to do to get it running, but the logistics, it's all going to depend on what engine you have.
And it's kind of a cool product. There's variations on it, but basically it's just something that'll run off a 110 outlet in the wall, and it's an overnight thing. So if I'm going to be flying in the morning, I'll plug it in the evening so that when I come out, the engine's warm. It's not hot, but it's warm. The oil can lubricate, to Pat's point, because if we've got a whole bunch of pudding at the bottom of the oil pan and we start the engine, the cam is just metal on metal. The pistons going in and out the rings. It's just metal on metal for quite a few seconds before the oil loosens up enough to get up there, and that's really doing a fair amount of damage. Pat, I wanted to run into human factors because, as you know, I'm a delicate flower of a flight instructor. I need a certain level of comfort. But Kawakawa kind of beat me to it again. I'm assuming it's a guy. I could be wrong. Kawakawa could be a woman. Post a picture, Kawakawa, so we'll know. But renters carry your own carbon monoxide detection or an oximeter along. That's actually not bad advice because in the summer, we may be flying with windows open or vents open and with the cabin heat off. But with the cabin heat on, in most general aviation airplanes, there is a risk to that, isn't there?
Yeah, the cabin heat is generally derived from a shroud around the exhaust system, and just basically pulling in that unfiltered air. If you have a leak in one of your exhaust pipes, the one especially or ones that this shroud surrounds, you could be piping carbon monoxide straight into the cabin and really not have any idea about it and perhaps until it's too late, if you ever even really do have an idea about it. You can't necessarily smell it. You may not realize that you're suffering from the effects of it. Even if you get a little bit of a headache, you may not really put two and two together and think about that. So carbon monoxide poisoning is a real threat. Now, some more sophisticated airplanes actually will have a burner. Oftentimes, it's in the nose cone of the airplane, and it's actually burning usually avgas on a live flame, and sending that into the cabin. But once again, what if the flame goes out? Now you've got unless there's some sort of fail-safe feature, and I'm not real familiar with those kind of systems. But at the very least, you may have some raw, unburned gas fumes being piped into the cabin. Now, you would think you'd smell that, but again, I don't have much experience with those kind of systems. So, but either way, carbon monoxide poisoning or some sort of other type of poisoning is a real issue when you're in a closed cockpit.
Yeah, and those Janitrol heaters, they had them on Seminoles when I used to fly Piper Seminole. It's a fire burning in the left wing, uses about half gallon an hour. But you're right, you've got combustion, which means you've got carbon monoxide. And part of your annual inspection every year is to remove that shroud from around the exhaust system and inspect it. But that just tells you already have a crack. That's something you could have found out before. Kay, I'm going to share a personal story here that's of great value, I'm sure. When I was instructing up north, and understand, I started out in Arizona. I live in Florida. I don't do well with cold. I apparently whined enough that at the company Christmas party, they presented me with a pair of long johns in company colors with my name and the company emblem on them because I really hate the cold. And, it stuck with me because I've known people who rush through their pre-flight because it's uncomfortable, and they'll do all sorts of things to cut corners, which really is antithetical to safety. We have to dress the part, and even if, like Pat was talking about, being in a shirt sleeve environment and then flying up above freezing level, we kind of have to dress for the issue we're going to face. And you're in San Diego, it's nice and warm, but if you're going up the Big Bear in the winter months, I suspect you're not wearing shorts.
Correct. It's not just the departure point and the destination, right? It's everything in between. And I do see people wearing, a short sleeve shirt, and they're leaving a desert climate and they're going to another desert climate, for example, Palm Springs. However, they're flying over snow-capped mountains, and they're wearing a short sleeve shirt, and they're not prepared for what's underneath them. And that's can be a big problem, particularly when you have, hostile terrain. And so you got to be prepared for your departure, your entire cruise segment, and your destination. And so, like you, Jamie, I like the warm weather. I am a tropical girl, and so I do carry all these extra layers of clothing and shelter, and if you really want a thorough list of what to carry and be prepared in the event that you make an all-field landing, watch AOPA Air Safety Institute's safety seminar called Survival After the Crash. So I saw that came out several years ago, and it prompted me to reevaluate what I'm carrying in my emergency kit, survival gear, and just miscellaneous things, like, for example, a personal locator beacon. I didn't have one before I saw that seminar, and I thought, you know what? I've always thought, all right, I have my ELT, and I even have an access panel in the front. But why if you need to leave the airplane? So this is where the PLB is really handy. There's no monthly subscription, and I could take it with me, because you may not always want to be with the airplane. So I know I don't mean to drift off on another topic, but going back to that seminar, Survival After the Crash, it really talks about, are you prepared for the entire flight, and why, if you have to land at any point in between your departure and destination, it's not just clothing, but it's also water and food and other things, and how to be noticed very quickly. And so watch that ASI safety seminar, and that'll give you a good idea of what you need to have on board for every flight.
That's a great recommendation. And Science Officer Brown, since you brought up that stuff about carbon monoxide poisoning, I'd like to talk a little bit about hypothermia. My introduction to this was when I was 19 and rode a motorcycle from Hartford, Connecticut to Florida in January. And I found out that it's not possible to dress well enough for that. And really cold. First time it ever happened to me in an airplane, I was flying up to St. Simon's Island, Georgia, and I think it was October. So it was pretty nice on the ground, but I got up to 5,500 feet. Man, I wish I had a jacket. It was cold. We really can get ourselves into trouble, not just discomfort, but actual trouble. Because if we start flirting with hypothermia, we got a problem, don't we?
Yeah, you talking about your experience, and we just, as we talked about, I think the last Tuesday we were together, we had just made a round trip to Denver, and we're flying at 95 to 8,500 feet going up there, and 9,500 feet coming back, and at altitude it was about 56 degrees. And of course, it was 95 on the ground, but it was about 56 degrees at altitude or thereabouts. And we ended up running the cabin heat for quite a bit of that trip. I wish that we had, of course, our jackets and everything were packed in the suitcases way back of the airplane. On the trip up, you can rest assured they were unpacked and in the back seat on the way back. But it didn't stop to think about, wait a minute, we're going north to an airport that's at a higher elevation, and it's going to be cold up there, and just didn't really stop to think about it, because most of my flying is done down here in the flatlands where it just doesn't get that cold. So it's a big deal.
We've talked a lot about the negative side of winter weather, and there's a lot to talk about that we have to be prepared for. But Kay, there's an upside too, and it really struck me. I had done most of my flight training down here in Florida in 152s, doing the private and commercial. And in the summer here, you're doing well with two people in full fuel. You're doing well to get 250 feet a minute. And then I went to work for a flight school in Connecticut in February, and it's in the 20s, and I'm getting 1,200 feet a minute out of the same airplane. I had no idea that could happen, but it really did teach me a lot about density altitude. But there are some real positives to flying in the winter, aren't there?
The performance of the aircraft is better when you have those colder temperatures. We always talk about know your density altitude, right? Especially when it's hot and high and humid. And so now, as winter approaches with these cooler temperatures, now I'm not saying that you shouldn't calculate density altitude. You still need to do that. It might still be an issue depending on where you're going and what the temperatures are and your weight, your configuration. So it is a little more easier to get into some of these high altitude airports. For example, I'll go back to Big Bear. I can't take a 172 into that airport on a hot and humid day in the summer. And in the past, when I have gone in the summer, it's been around sunrise or at sunset. And it's not the problem is not getting into the airport, it's getting out. And so you do need to, calculate performance and all that. And you'll notice that in the wintertime, it's a lot easier to get to than in the summer. You're not going to get that, 150, 200 feet or 300 feet per minute climb. It'll be better. So
I like that. Hey, in the comments, whether you're watching on Facebook, whether you're watching on YouTube, just type in me if you've ever experienced hypothermia, which is getting way cold, or hyperthermia, which is getting way hot. We have both of those here. Actually, the three of us, we do the hyperthermia thing a lot. I've got a friend who's a retired Delta captain. When he was a line guy, he actually passed out on the wing of a DC-3 fueling it because he just got so overheated. But on the flip side of that, Pat, you learned to fly in Michigan, which I believe looks like a mitten, if I'm not mistaken, which is a cold weather thing.
Yeah.
And that being the case, do you have any particular recollections of your first experiences with winter and maybe precautions or things you had to do to counteract the effects of winter weather?
Well, other than pre-flighting it when it's 25 degrees outside and the wind's blowing 15 knots, that scarred me for life. Well,
that's why you live in Texas. That's the real reason.
Part of the reason, yeah. But well, I mean, everything that we've talked about today, every single element of everything we've talked about today, touches you when you're flying in that climate on a regular basis. You have to allow enough time to preheat the airplane. You've got to make sure that you're dressed well for the experience. I learned to fly in a Cessna 150. And you get two people in a Cessna 150, and my flight instructor was, probably 200 pounds. Both of us wearing winter coats. There's just not a whole lot of room to move around in that thing. So, that becomes an issue. If you're, it wasn't uncommon to go have a lesson after we had some snow. Now, I'm not talking about, 3 or 4 feet of snow, but maybe 3 or 4 inches, 5 inches of snow or something like that. And it was a small non-towered field at a small airport, and the snow plows didn't always get out there as quickly as you hope for them to do. But, we would jump in the airplane with 2 or 3 inches of snow on the ground and taxi out, and you could see the lights along the runway. So it was no problem where the pavement was. But in an airplane with wheel pants, that snow can get packed up underneath those wheel pants, and that can make for a kind of an exciting thing. I would imagine. I've never experienced that. And the other thing too is that, if the snow is too deep or if you're taxiing through standing water that's just about ready to freeze but hasn't yet, and you get your brakes wet, that water can eventually freeze on your brake pads and your rotors. And again, it can make for kind of an exciting time, especially if one freezes and the other doesn't. So, these are all really realistic things that you should could continue to consider when you're flying in the winter weather.
Yeah, John Delanoy has a great comment here. I really like it. We were talking earlier about the better performance. He says he flew one day when it was negative 17 Celsius, and the altimeter setting was 30.62. He was in a Cessna 172. So you've got a really cold temperature and a really high pressure. So you've got tremendously dense air. He says the 172 felt like a rocket. And I'll bet it did, because I know what you're saying, Pat, about the 150 with whopping 100 horsepower under the best circumstances. But all of a sudden in cold weather, while it's tight in the cockpit, the performance is just amazing. Really something. Christopher Ritchie asks about, what about putting skis on the landing gear? What about landing on a frozen lake? I have not put skis on the landing gear, although I know we gave away a Super Cub on amphibious floats with skis a couple of years ago. If y'all remember that one, that was a fun plane to fly. I like that. And I know Lake George, New York used to, anyhow, Lake George, New York would open up the lake to landing on the ice part of the year. I've never done that. I'm probably too cowardly to do that, but I would certainly consider it. Kay, one of the other things we might think about with winter weather flying on the positive side is the visibility. That really cold, clear air, generally high pressure. I mean, it is a beautiful view, but we do have to watch out for glare, don't we? I mean, as beautiful as it is, if there's all that snow, good sunglasses is a must, don't you think?
I agree. And it's not just for the cold, but also anytime you're coming in to land at sunset. I remember I mentioned that on our previous episode where we were talking about our flight gear, and I said that the sunglasses is a must-have for where I am. If you're coming into Palomar Airport at sunset, you can't really see anything because of the sun, and the snow can do the same thing. And Jamie, I don't know if you remember our test flight when we first joined AOPA in 2014. Remember they brought us out in it was February, and I remember thinking about, all right, well, this is going to be interesting. I haven't flown in this kind of weather in a couple of decades, and yes, the glare is you get that view out there where it's almost like being over the ocean, where it's hard to tell what altitude you're at. And you get a reflection off of the water, and the same thing happens in the snow. So having the right gear with you in the cold climate, not just clothing, but also for your eyes is a must.
I actually remember that, and I hadn't thought of it in a while. That was February 2015, and I think we both had to go out for a right seat checkout. I
That's
had
correct.
done a left seat checkout with Dave Hirschman in Sebring, Florida, but we had to go for a right seat checkout, and it snowed, and it was supposed to snow. And if I
Right.
recall correctly, the fabulous Mr. Hirschman had invited you and I to his house for dinner, but
Right.
it just kept snowing and snowing and snowing.
Yeah, we had to
So our
cancel.
flights got pushed back. And that's one of those things that, being a Southerner, I don't even think about. And I suspect you didn't either.
Right.
Our morning flights were pushed back because the taxiways weren't plowed and the runways weren't plowed. And I mean, it took forever. I think we moved the flight 2 or 3 times till
We
they
did.
could get the
Because it was a
areas in
winter
front of
storm
the
that
hangars
it
plowed.
was, of course, the two people from the two warmest parts of the country were coming up to Frederick, and that's when we had that snowstorm, and my rental car got stuck at the hangar there coming out. I remember that flight very well. But part of that pre-flight planning was also I wanted to make sure all the little things like my gloves, make
Mhm.
sure that your hand you don't get frostbitten, and be prepared, because when you go out and you do that pre-flight, it's not just the airplane, but you want to be ready for those circumstances. And so I think it was 0 degrees on the day that I had my right seat checkout, and even testing things like the pitot heat. That's really important. And I don't remember if we were going to shoot an approach or not, or if it was just a VFR checkout. I forget, but I still go through the motions and I check everything through. Be careful not to actually grab the pitot heat. You can just tell that it works by the warm air around it, but make sure that you know when to operate that. And I'm going to go off on a tangent here on the pitot heat, because something that I see students do all the time is they don't know when to turn it on and when to turn it off. And so here's an important tip. Right before you take off, I like to do the lights, camera, action, and I'm checking all the switches, right, for the lights, and that's where the pitot heat is usually near that. You should never turn the pitot heat on while you're taxiing. It's right before takeoff. And then you got to make sure that you turn it off after you land, before you contact ground, because you have that pitot heat on for a while. 10 minutes, you're going to burn it on the ground. So those type of things are not something that I'm used to out here in California, but I needed to make sure that I did that. And obviously, though, that flight went well, because here I am working for AOPA.
I love it. I think it's time. We've never done this before, but I believe we should have a cross-platform challenge here. So I'm going to tell a story, but while I do, I want the Facebook viewers to tell me your worst winter flying story. Just put it in the comments there. While the YouTube viewers, give me your best winter flying story, and let's see who comes out ahead in this, or just more entertaining. And this brought it to mind, Kay, talking about having to plow all those taxiways and runways. I don't normally deal with that. I was flying in Connecticut at a flight school, very good flight school up there. And another instructor and I both had to cancel a few days' flights because the wind was single runway, 1836. The wind had been really strong out of the west for days above the crosswind component. And then it snowed really hard. But both of us had students that needed nighttime. So we got a call from the airport that the taxiways were plowed. They were working on the runway and it would be ready to go by like 5 o'clock, which, hey, in the winter, it's getting dark, or it is dark. So my buddy Don and I went out. We both had our students. We met them. We briefed. We're going to take off before it gets dark, and we're going to go do a cross country. We'll get cross country time on the way home, which will finish up their cross country requirement, and we'll finish up the 10 night landings at the airport. What neither one of us realized was when they plowed the runway, they covered up the runway lights. And we took off while it was still light, and we went off on a cross country, different destinations, and we both came back and faced the exact same problem. It was just a dark hole. There was nothing telling us where the runway was. Luckily, there was a road that ran parallel to the runway, not too far away. So unfortunately, we couldn't let our students do the night landings they needed to. It's one of those things that never even would have occurred to me to check that the lights are uncovered. I always did after that, but that was the first time. And man, it just caught me by surprise. And I don't know, Pat, have you ever done something like that where you just didn't even think that this was going to be a problem? And there it was.
You know, I mean, nothing that immediately comes to mind, but what I do remember about flying at night in the wintertime when it was clear outside, especially with a full moon, is that the reflection of the moonlight off the snow just made it just almost like daylight.
Yeah.
It's just incredibly bright and incredibly beautiful. And I mean, all the reasons that we love to fly embodied right there. And, you know, on a winter's night when there's not a cloud in the sky, stars everywhere, full moon, fresh snow on the ground. The air is smooth as silk. I mean, it's just, that's about the only thing I miss about flying at night in the wintertime.
Just for a fleeting moment there, I thought kindly about New England. And I don't want to anger anybody, but it's just my mom lives in New England. She loves it. She's a lifer, but I remember that as well. And one of the things that really stuck with me was you could see the Connecticut River cutting through the valley when the moon was out, and even the lights of the city would reflect off the snow for quite a ways around it. There's just this great glow, and it is a really beautiful thing. That winter flying, and as you say, night flying, it requires some precautions, but it's a truly beautiful thing. And Pat, I'm coming back to you because there's one topic we haven't talked about that maybe people accidentally think is more likely in the winter, maybe think is less likely in the winter, but there's actually some stats on it. Carb ice is a big deal wherever we are. It's actually worth knowing it, how it works and why it happens so that you don't get in a jam with it.
I thought you'd never ask, Jamie.
Well,
Donnie,
and that's it for this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, we'll be here next time. Donnie, would you throw up that carb ice chart, please? There you go. So, take a look at that. Let's leave it up if you would for a couple of minutes here, because if you take a look at that, look at the broad range of temperature and humidities where you can experience carb ice. In fact, there's probably more areas there where you could possibly experience carb ice than there are areas when you might not experience carb ice. I mean, it can be hot outside, but with a high relative humidity, you have the chance of some carburetor ice just as likely as it can be when it's relatively cold outside. You can get carb ice. So, this chart, by the way, is you can Google it and download it if you want to look at it and really study it. but it just goes to show you that carb ice is a real possibility virtually any time.
Yeah. You know, it was a big surprise to me when I was flying in Florida when I realized night flights in Florida are prime carb ice opportunities. Really high humidity, temperatures in the 50s to 80s, depending on the time of year. But because of that high humidity, it can happen. But of course, in the winter as well, you know, it can be down in the 30s and 40s. And if that front is coming through and you're going to be having snow or drizzly rain later, you can absolutely get carb ice. And Kay, what freaks people out about carb ice is the engine starts to run rough and loses a couple hundred RPM. So they revert to their training, something they've never really done. They've just trained on it. They pull on the carb heat and it gets worse.
It's worse.
So they turn it off. Talk to us about that. What's the proper procedure?
So when you have carburetor ice and you pull that carb heat out, it will get worse. And what's happening is that the ice that's in the venturi tube within the carburetor, it's breaking up. So as that ice is breaking up, it's going to get worse. But you got to keep that carburetor heat on so that that ice within the venturi tube can melt. Then the RPM will pick back up. But if you pull the carburetor heat out and you notice, oh my goodness, it sounds worse now, and push it back in, then eventually you're going to have a more serious problem and will lead to engine failure because you haven't gotten rid of that carburetor ice. So this is where it's important to know that it'll get better before getting, it'll get worse before getting better. And then to just trust the system is going to work and leave that carburetor heat out until all of that ice is melted. So this is where you got to know what's in your POH and know how to deal with these procedures. It does not have to become an emergency. So get with the CFI if you're not familiar with how the system works, and review the POH. And then when that happens, follow the procedure.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. By the way, John Delanoy has really leapt into first place as my favorite viewer tonight. He's done a great job. He actually did share a story about, I guess it's his best experience because it worked out well, but a little bit of nerve-wrackingness. I'll tell you the story. And by the way, John Delanoy, you're going to want to write to ambassadors@aopa.org and share your mailing address, and we're going to send you an AOPA hat because you shared a great story and you've been a terrific participant. You're an industry leader. Let's just put it that way. John says he had just started flight school, well under 10 hours, so very little experience, high anxiety level, great excitement. They were practicing power on stalls, he and his CFI. He pulled the power to slow down and the engine almost quit. The instructor took the controls and radioed the airport that he wanted to come in. When ATC heard why, he asked very pointedly if we wanted to declare an emergency. At first, my CFI hesitated, but then he said, no, we almost had an engine failure. We're declaring an emergency. The rest of the story is fortunately boring. We had no issues and later determined it was probably carb icing, but I learned it's better to declare and get down fast, even if you're not sure. Then that was also the last time I flew in the cold without a hat, gloves, and a good coat. Man, that's a great story. And I've had carb ice where all of a sudden I just lost 400 RPMs. I mean, like that. And it does jar you. Pat, have you had carb ice in flight before where it's just out of nowhere?
Yeah, but not to the extent that you did or that John did. But yeah, that's 182s are kind of notorious for carb icing because of the way the engines are plumbed. Yep. And a couple of 182s that I've owned over the years had carburetor temperature instruments on the instrument panel, so you could kind of watch whether it was in the yellow or in the green or what have you. And I was always told if it gets to a certain point, just pull that carburetor heat out preemptively. And so fortunately, I've never had anything like that happen.
Cavalier 102.5 says, in the right conditions, can you actually create carb ice by pulling on your carb heat? I don't think so. I've never heard that unless there's a problem. What happens when you pull on your carb heat, hot air from the exhaust system, that muff that heats the cabin, is routed into the carburetor, so it'll melt ice. The problem is hot air is less dense than cold air, so your mixture gets a lot richer. That's why when you pull on the carb heat, the engine runs worse than it did with just the carb ice. The problem is, and Kay alluded to this earlier, I think, you pull on that carb heat and it starts to run worse, and people freak out and turn it off. Now you've kind of locked yourself into a scenario that's not going to work out. So you kind of have to be aware that when you pull carb heat on, it's going to get worse. You're going to lose a little bit more RPM, but over the next 5 to 7 minutes, it's going to come back. And from that point on, and I'll tell you, Pat, when I had that where I just lost 400 RPM, I did land at the nearest airport, verified it was nothing else. It's just carb heat. Luckily, it's 90 some odd degrees. So in a half an hour, I'm good to go again. But I used carb heat twice on the way to my destination just to make sure it didn't happen again. Because I'm cowardly and a delicate flower. I think it was Carburetor. Kay, is there anything you would like to leave our folks with as we depart for another evening of an Ask Your Ambassador from the You Can Fly Institute scattered all over the Sunbelt of the United States?
Well, I know this topic was about winter is coming, but regardless of what season is, be prepared. And as we all alluded to, no matter where you're flying from or where you're going to, make sure that you're prepared for that entire flight. And if you need to make an off-field landing, make sure that you have what you need to get by on your own until help comes. So it's all about preparation.
Boy, that's great advice. And coming back to Science Officer Brown, I don't want to put any pressure on you, but could you say something that just resonates in our memory for the rest of our lives?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me something about this. I was ready.
Absolutely, Pat. Could you read us a few stanzas of the FAI?
Dearly beloved.
We're very serious people. Don't try this at home.
I can't add anything to the words of wisdom that Kay just finished bestowing upon us. Just know your POH, know your airplane, be careful, take all the appropriate precautions, and go forth and aviate in the wintertime. It can be absolutely gorgeous and a wonderful, wonderful experience. Heartwarming, may not warm the rest of you, but
that's the thing. It's possible to be safe and have an enormous amount of fun at the same time. So Go out and hit both goals. We'll be back right here on your computer at your house, your tablet, your phone, whatever you've got with you on October 25th, 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. In the middle, do the math. You're a pilot. You can do that kind of a conversion. I look forward to seeing you then. On behalf of Donnie McKay, who made all this happen tonight, Pat Brown, and Kay Sunrum, I'm Jamie Beckett. We'll see you next time.
Good night.
Good night.